you going to say something, Sonia?
Just to say, this is an area that immigrants here in Rochester are having a dreadful time.
Their kids are different. Yeah.
Very different, and they're really having a hard time.
You read that, and certainly we've experienced some of that, haven't we? You come to a new culture, you come to a Western culture, you talk to your kids in high school that are your buddies and your friends, and they talk to their friends differently, and shows on TV influence what you say. It's totally different, isn't it?
I was at the recent meeting that was downtown that the NPR and Post Bulletin put on fear and the reality of whether we have more crime or we don't have more crime. And a lot of people, the Islamic tradition people, spoke. Young men spoke first, but then finally a lady in her charter, I believe, was translated by a fellow, and she was very upset because she was one of the moms that complained that they wouldn't go find her daughter as quickly. The police wouldn't respond to her concern. And it's obvious they're having a hard time controlling, and they want the police's help to discipline their kids, is the way
Which is a number of issues you're talking about,
Yeah.
Sonia, but
right.
you know, obviously that she went to a public meeting for everybody that didn't hear that, and a lot of concern among parents about the way that their children are acting differently in this culture, and some concern about the police not responding quite the same way if their children were not coming home, or if they were having problems with their kids as they might with a more traditional Anglo resident of Rochester. Yeah, good point. Marriage is greatly encouraged in Islam. A Muslim marriage is both a sacred act and a legal agreement, much like we might practice it in the church as well, in which either partner is free to include legitimate conditions, and this is what you're talking about, Carla. As a result, divorce, though uncommon, is permitted only as a last resort. Marriage customs vary widely from one country to another. You know, it's interesting. They have something in the Koran that's much the same as in the Bible. Marriage is created as a mate for man. You know, we talk about Eve being created out of the rib of Adam as he's sleeping one day. It gets translated in the King James Version. Do you remember how it goes? She is to be a helpmeet. One word or two?
One.
Actually, I looked it up today. Mine didn't have a hyphen. I thought it was one word. But I suppose it means you're supposed to be a help meet or fitting, right? For man. I think that's what it means. I'm not good on King James language, but that's why I don't read it anymore, and most of us don't. But it's help meet for the man. You know what it says in the New Revised Standard Version? Do you remember? It says helper as his partner, which, you know, it shows changing language, changing ideas and customs, sensibilities. I like that version. You know, I'm not, you know, if you're a flaming feminist or something, that might be harder to accept that kind of language, but it's talking about partnership, so it's, I think, moving in that direction. So I think in general, it just shows how marriage or language changes over time and becomes reflective of what we're trying to communicate.
That's why they said they always use Arabic, because that's Muhammad's words.
Yeah.
And nobody can interpret it, even if they don't understand Arabic.
That's why they always use Arabic, and so they obviously have no problems with translation like we do, right? There's no splits in the Muslim. Actually, they have just as many splits, just as many problems, even though they're all trying to use Arabic. They do, but it's still part of the challenge, I think, of dealing with language, isn't it? Yeah. Marriage, according to the Quran, men and women have the same rank before God and are created with the same worth and the same rights. Still, God created them differently and thus gave them different rights and responsibilities. You know, I think that's kind of the way things work out for us too, though I don't know if we would have said that in quite the same way as Christians interpreting the Bible. Then again, in actual practice, from what I understand, if you're going before a court of law, it takes 2 women as witnesses to equal 1 man as a witness in a court of law. So there's been some traditions that basically say that women are only worth half as much as a man. My apologies to all of you women that are here. But you can begin to see why some things like that spring up, can't you? Yeah. and certainly part of the thinking. You know, do they seem equal? I mean, as you read and study about this, do men and women seem equal?
No.
I mean, you read horror stories, don't you? Of the way that women can be treated, and we'll talk a little bit about that more in a second, but I have a hard time believing that it seems equal at all for the majority of households. Now, again, here's something that, when it was written, the Quran dramatically improved the position of women by securing their rights. These rights included the right to own personal property, the right to an inheritance, and comprehensive legal protection. Every woman has the right to be provided for by her father or by her husband. And, you know, I think that's important to acknowledge. I think the Bible does that too. That, you know, when you read a lot of the texts in the Bible, some of the ones in Ephesians, women be in submission to your husbands, that's not a very radical thing to say in Paul's time. But then I think it puts the onus on the man. Men, love your wives like Christ loved the church. You can't just treat her like property. You can't just divorce her on a whim. You have to treat her like Christ loved the church. And when you do that, then maybe you'll have the basis for marriage that's radically different than it was before. So I think the Quran does improve things, but I think part of the struggle for modern Islam, just for modern Christianity, is, so does that stop along the way sometimes? Or do we continue to try to understand the changing roles of women, allow for maybe yet a different interpretation of the role of women in the culture and in the church? I mean, a prime example of that would be, you know, women in the ministry, ordained ministry. 30, 40 years ago, or before the time that the ELCA changed its vote and predecessor bodies, we would have said no. There was not a change. But today we'd say, well, yeah, there has been a change, and we believe that God can equally call men and women to the task of ministry, public ministry in the church. The Catholic Church wouldn't say that, neither would the Missouri Synod and Southern Baptists and many other churches, but it's something we've had to struggle with as we've struggled with the role of women in society and culture. Yep.
I have a question with regard to treatment of women. I work in the hospitality industry here in Rochester, so, and in my building in particular, it's owned by a family from the Middle East, so we have many Middle Easterners staying in my property, and I don't see any kind of disrespect or bad treatment of women in my building at all. Like, I see differences. So I'm wondering if some of the mistreatment has to do with like their rank in society or the amount of money that they're able to, that they have, or like their ability to travel to the U.S., if that has something to do with how they're treated in a respectful way versus maybe back in their homeland. So, you know, I'm sitting here taking all this in and comparing it to each day that I'm interacting with the men and women in my building, and I'm not sure if it's behind closed doors where there's mistreatment, but in public eye it does seem to be, there's respect there. So I'm interested in learning more about that.
Yeah, and I'm going to guess that there are many answers to that question. I think some of the stories we're going to hear are going to be anecdotal, and there's going to be horror stories that we could drag out in public. I don't know if we can say what's most common. I'm going to guess that for people that are trying to follow the Quran, they're going to say that there's an attempt to honor and respect women in that culture. But you could also argue the flip side of that. If you're constantly asked to wear a certain kind of dress and stay home and not go out in public and attend to the needs of men, that says something too about your role. Yeah.
I don't know if Sharia law plays into this or not, but they do get into that.
Yeah, well,
on the men-women thing.
yeah, a lot of this stuff is not spelled out specifically in that Sharia law, but yeah. Let's read. Go ahead.
What's different in our culture?
There's certainly women that are well respected here and equal partners, and then there's plenty of places where they're not. I think that's true. That's a good point. There's just as much diversity based on our traditions and teachings. We have plenty of things in the Bible, but that doesn't mean that every Christian man honors and loves his wife, does it? Well, let's read that, should we? As to those women whose part ye fear disloyalty and ill conduct, admonish them first. Next, refuse to share their beds, and last, beat them lightly. You know, those are the kind of things I'm sure for people that are modern Muslims, maybe moderate Muslims, they kind of wish it wasn't in there. But it is. That's part of the tradition that they live with. We've got things that we wish weren't in the Bible either, let's be honest. Some of the stuff in the Old Testament.
Oh, yeah. I kind of wonder how much influence the freedom and individuality and the entrance into the working world of the women in Turkey, how long it'll take before that invades some of the other Islamic peoples.
Yeah, there's a real tug of war. Should women work outside the home? And that certainly allows a measure of freedom and independence and free thinking. You're just bound to think differently if you're out in the world every day than if you're home all the time, I think.
They said that in the morning paper, Laura Logan was out during Friday night celebration in Cairo.
Okay.
CBS correspondent.
Okay.
And what it went on to say was that during the days that they were protesting, women were treated with respect, and they didn't have to be guarded by their men from being groped in public. And that night, that went out the window. She got separated from her crew. She was groped, sexually assaulted.
Did everybody hear that? The CBS correspondent, Laura Logan, whatever her name is, she was treated with respect up until the time that they declared freedom, and then in the midst of the celebration, that kind of went out the window. She and lots of other women were groped and treated with less than respectful
And it was the women,
ways.
Egyptian women that came to her aid first, and then finally the police came.
Yeah.
Keep in mind that she's a tall, blonde American woman. And that blondness is very important. I have a blonde daughter. We were in Istanbul. She was very often pinched. She learned to protect herself.
But
very well.
apparently all Egyptian women are groped in public, is what this article.
You know, when we were in Europe for one summer and in Italy, that happened in Italy all the time too. I don't know if anybody's from Italian background here, I'm sorry, but it's just the way some cultures are. It doesn't excuse it, but it certainly is the way some cultures, and it's more readily acceptable. It is. Let's go on. The Quran has this to say about women. Prophet, enjoin your wives and your daughters and the wives of true believers to draw their veils close around them. This is kind of the key verse in the Quran that they look back at to talk about the Quran, maybe not requiring, but certainly pointing strongly to the use of veils. That is more proper so that they may be recognized and not be molested. Enjoin believing women to turn their eyes away from temptation and to preserve their chastity, not to display their adornments, except such as are normally revealed, to draw their veils over their bosoms, and not to display their finery except to their husbands, their fathers, their husbands' fathers, their sons, their stepsons, their brothers' sons, their sisters' sons, their women servants, and their slave girls, male attendants lacking in natural vigor, and children who have no carnal knowledge of women. And let them not stop their feet when walking so as to reveal their hidden trinkets. You've got a minute at your table to talk about what that passage thinks, what you think that passage says about the Quran, okay?